Detroit, Michigan, autumn 1945. The air inside the River Rouge plant hums like a living creature. Steam hisses from overhead pipes. Sparks leap from welding torches. A conveyor belt carries the steel skeleton of another aircraft toward the light. A small group of German engineers walk silently across the polished concrete floor. Their boots echo beneath the rafters, swallowed by the rhythm of machinery. They were once the masters of Europe's most advanced industry, builders of Messerschmitts, Tigers, and U-boats. Now they stand as observers, not creators. One of them, a man who once oversaw production near Bremen, looks down the endless line. Engines, wings, fuselages, men and women working side by side. Each movement synchronized, efficient, tireless. Every few minutes, a completed plane rolls off the line. He whispers to no one in particular, almost in disbelief. Now I see why we lost. The guide says nothing. There's no need. Around them, America's industrial heart beats at full rhythm, cold, metallic, unstoppable. Outside, the sun glints off rows of finished bombers stretching into the horizon. The war is over. But for these men, the realization of defeat has only just begun. To understand that moment of quiet surrender inside an American factory, we must return to a decade earlier, to the world that shaped both empires of industry before the storm of war began. It is January 1933, and Germany stands on the edge of transformation. Adolf Hitler has just taken power. His speeches speak of pride, destiny, and the restoration of a wounded nation. But beneath the rhetoric lies something more practical, a plan to rearm through production, to forge weapons, not just ideals. Across the Ruhr, smokestacks once darkened by the Great Depression begin to breathe again. The Krupp steelworks hums with renewed life. Precision engineers return to their benches. Lathes, drills, and presses awaken after years of silence. Germany's revival is mechanical before it is military. By 1936, the foundations of Hitler's rearmament are in full swing. The nation's factories are alive with the rhythm of expansion. But it is a distinctly German rhythm. Production relies on precision, craftsmanship, and centralized control. Tanks like the Panzer III are assembled with care and expertise, each part finely machined, each line supervised by engineers. The German model values excellence over scale, an echo of the old guild system that had shaped Europe's artisans for centuries. While Germany retools, the United States turns inward. The Great Depression has scarred its economy, leaving millions unemployed. Assembly lines stand still, their belts idle and cold. In Detroit, Ford Motor Company's vast River Rouge plant, once a symbol of industrial might, now runs at half its capacity. Yet inside these dormant facilities lies something Germany lacks, the blueprint for mass production. America's genius is not in precision, but in process. From Henry Ford's assembly line to the mass manufacture of radios, refrigerators, and automobiles, American industry has mastered repetition, the art of producing millions of identical units faster than any other nation on Earth. In the 1930s, that talent lies dormant, waiting for a purpose beyond consumer goods. Meanwhile, in Europe, the signs of war are unmistakable. The Spanish Civil War becomes a testing ground for German technology. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Stuka dive bomber, the Panzer I. German factories run efficiently, but not infinitely. Production targets are met, but barely. Materials are scarce, supply lines tight. Still, to the world outside, Germany seems unstoppable, a machine reborn. By 1939, the illusion of balance between craftsmanship and mass production begins to fracture. When Hitler's armies march into Poland, the Wehrmacht carries the finest weapons Europe has ever seen, but not in the numbers a world war demands. Each panzer is a marvel of engineering and a liability of scale. Each aircraft, hand-assembled by skilled workers, takes days or weeks to finish. For now, it is enough. Germany sweeps across Poland and then France, its victories swift and decisive. To its leaders, this proves the system works. Precision, they believe, triumphs over quantity. But across the Atlantic, in a nation still clinging to neutrality, the tide of industry begins to shift. Franklin D. Roosevelt, watching the devastation in Europe, calls for preparedness. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declares in December 1940. The words echo across factory walls and drafting tables. Contracts are signed with Ford, General Motors, Boeing, and North American Aviation. Production begins not in thousands, but in millions. American engineers, many of them veterans of civilian industry, are given a simple directive: make it faster, make it cheaper, make it count. And so, as Germany celebrates its victories, America quietly reawakens. By the time Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, U.S. factories are already preparing for war. Machine tools are shipped to new plants. Car assembly lines are retooled for tanks and bombers. Industrial cities expand overnight. Yet in Berlin, the belief in superiority remains unshaken. The German workforce, disciplined and proud, sees itself as the world's best, unaware that an industrial storm is forming beyond the Atlantic, one driven not by genius but by scale. The world has entered a race not just of armies, but of factories, one that will soon determine the fate of nations. And by the time that race begins in earnest, one side will already be miles ahead. By the end of 1941, the race that would define the Second World War was fully underway. On December 7th, Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, and within hours the industrial giant across the Atlantic awakened in full. The following day, the United States declared war, and so did its factories. Almost overnight, the nation transformed itself into something no enemy fully comprehended: a machine of machines. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Boeing, and thousands of subcontractors turned from consumer goods to combat equipment. Production orders once measured in hundreds were now counted in tens of thousands. In Washington, Franklin Roosevelt's War Production Board began an unprecedented coordination effort. Automobile plants that once produced shiny sedans now assembled Sherman tanks and B-24 bombers. Women flooded into the workforce, their uniforms factory overalls instead of khaki or gray. Across the Midwest, a new kind of front opened. One fought not with rifles but with rivet guns. The scale was staggering. In 1942, American industry built more aircraft than all the Axis powers combined. In 1943, it doubled that figure. The shipyards of the East and West Coasts launched a new Liberty ship every few days. Trains carried endless loads of steel, rubber, copper, and oil from state to state, all converging toward the war effort. Meanwhile, Germany's early industrial advantage began to erode. The four-year plan, introduced in 1936, had tied production to tight resource management and strict control from Berlin. Yet as the war expanded, that system grew brittle. Germany's access to raw materials depended heavily on conquest: iron from France, oil from Romania, labor from occupied Europe. Every victory stretched its logistics thinner. Every new front demanded more supplies than its factories could provide. Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments in 1942, recognized the danger immediately. He streamlined operations, centralized control, and pushed for efficiency. Under his leadership, German output rose dramatically, but it was a temporary surge, achieved through forced labor and brutal exhaustion. The Reich's industrial miracle came at the price of human suffering. In contrast, the United States built its strength on voluntary mobilization and automation. The Willow Run plant in Michigan, designed by Ford engineers, symbolized the transformation. Within its vast hangars, B-24 bombers rolled off the line at the astonishing rate of one every hour by 1944. Workers operated in 3 shifts, around the clock, surrounded by light, noise, and relentless motion. Where Germany prized precision, America prized repetition. The results were visible everywhere: simple, robust designs that could be built fast, repaired easily, and shipped globally. The Sherman tank, derided by German crews for its thinner armor, existed in such numbers that its mere abundance overwhelmed the battlefield. For every German tank destroyed, America built 5 more. For every plane lost, 10 replacements waited on the runway. By mid-1943, the contrast between the two systems had become undeniable. German engineers, still dependent on manual fitting and skilled craftsmanship, could not match the tempo. A Messerschmitt Bf 109 required thousands of hand-adjusted parts. An American P-51 Mustang emerged from an automated line with interchangeable components, ready for flight within hours. Even Hitler began to notice the imbalance. In meetings, he raged about the unfairness of America's production numbers, more a confession of desperation than strategy. But there was no turning back. Germany's labor force was already stretched to its limits, its cities under bombardment, its factories scattered and hidden in forests and tunnels. By 1944, as Allied bombers darkened the skies above the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland lay in ruins. Precision machines were dismantled and moved underground. Production continued, but the rhythm was broken. The war of steel and oil had become one of endurance, and endurance was something the United States possessed in limitless supply. Across occupied Europe, German workers began to hear rumors of factories overseas that never slept, of ships loaded with tanks and planes arriving in endless convoys. Some dismissed them as propaganda. Others began to suspect the truth. For the first time, doubt entered the hearts of those who had believed in Germany's technical superiority. It was no longer a question of who built the best machines. It was who could build the most, and for how long. The war had turned from conquest to consumption, and soon, that imbalance would become impossible to ignore. In the United States, the war was not only fought by soldiers in uniform. It was waged by millions of ordinary men and women whose battlegrounds were factory floors. The hum of production replaced the roar of artillery. The clang of steel was their weapon. By 1943, over 18 million American civilians were employed in war industries. Among them were 6 million women. Rosie the Riveter became both a symbol and a promise. They worked with quiet precision, assembling engines, riveting wings, welding armor plates. Every shift ended with grease on their hands and exhaustion in their eyes. But behind that fatigue was pride. Each machine completed meant another life saved at the front. These workers operated with an understanding that efficiency was survival. Factory managers implemented time studies, quality checks, and streamlined workflows. A riveter might never see a battlefield, yet her repetition, thousands of identical actions per day, had the same impact as a soldier's trigger pull. In Germany, the human story was starkly different. Skilled craftsmen worked long hours under strict supervision. As the war dragged on, foreign laborers and prisoners filled the gaps, their conditions brutal and their morale broken. Productivity suffered. The difference in morale and method, one driven by empowerment, the other by coercion, would determine the outcome long before the armies met. German engineering was legendary, intricate, precise, elegant. Tanks like the Tiger I embodied this philosophy. A masterpiece of design, but costly, slow to produce, and mechanically temperamental. Its components required specialized materials and manual fitting. Even minor repairs demanded trained mechanics. In contrast, American engineers prioritized functionality over perfection. The M4 Sherman tank could be built rapidly, shipped easily, and repaired in the field with minimal training. Its design emphasized interchangeable parts, the key to true mass production. Aircraft production followed the same pattern. The German Focke-Wulf FW-190 was technologically advanced, but produced in limited numbers. The American P-51 Mustang, designed for mass assembly, filled the skies in tens of thousands. Where German factories built machines as works of art, American plants built them as instruments of war. The difference wasn't only in philosophy, it was in scalability. Automation replaced artistry. Conveyor belts carried components from one station to another without pause. Factories no longer relied on the genius of individual engineers. They depended on systems that made genius unnecessary. The Germans, with their love for craftsmanship, had unknowingly built a bottleneck into their war effort. Every war is an equation, the balance between resources, production, and destruction. Germany entered the Second World War with limited access to oil, steel, and labor. Each tank or aircraft required strategic decisions: which front to supply, which material to prioritize. The United States, by contrast, possessed nearly endless reserves. Its continental resources, coal, iron, oil, copper, were unmatched. With oceans as barriers, its industrial base remained untouched by enemy bombs. America's factories grew without interruption, while Germany's were forced into secrecy and dispersion. Roosevelt's administration coordinated production with military logistics in a way no nation had attempted before. The War Production Board rationed raw materials, standardized designs, and ensured that every nut and bolt served a purpose. It was not chaos but orchestration, a national symphony of industry. Economically, the results were staggering. By 1944, the U.S. was producing 96,000 aircraft per year, 57,000 landing craft, and 8,000 ships. Its gross national product had doubled since 1939. Germany's figures, though improved under Speer, were dwarfed by comparison. Each attempt to accelerate output was met with shortages, sabotage, or bombing raids. The more the Reich tried to control, the more it strained its own system. War had turned into a contest of mathematics, and in that arithmetic, America's columns always added up higher. The American advantage went beyond machines. It was mental. Industrial production was treated as an engineering problem to be solved through process, not prestige. Henry Ford's philosophy of flow, that the product should move, not the worker, became a national creed. Every part of an American bomber, tank, or rifle followed a standardized path. If one factory was destroyed, another could continue without interruption. Designs were simplified so that anyone could build them, whether in Detroit or Dallas. German factories, however, remained tied to individuality. Engineers modified blueprints mid-production, adjusting details to improve performance. Admirable in peacetime, disastrous in war. Lack of uniformity slowed logistics, complicated repairs, and drained resources. While the Germans built monuments to perfection, the Americans built mechanisms for replication. The U.S. industrial system didn't need to be brilliant. It just needed to be relentless, and relentless it became. The differences in human effort, technology, economy, and mindset were no longer abstract. They were measurable, visible, and irreversible. By 1943, these forces had begun to converge toward a single, devastating realization for the Reich's leadership and its workers alike. Leadership in war is often measured by battles won. But in the Industrial War, it was measured by factories built. Franklin D. Roosevelt understood this better than most. When he declared that the United States must become the great arsenal of democracy, he wasn't issuing a metaphor. He was giving the country a blueprint. Roosevelt's strength lay not in technical expertise, but in delegation. He empowered industrialists like William Knudsen of General Motors, Henry Kaiser, and Charles Sorensen of Ford to lead the transformation of civilian plants into war engines. Knudsen, once a car executive, became the chief coordinator of America's war production. He brought business efficiency to the battlefield, converting private industry into a single national network. Kaiser pioneered modular shipbuilding, Liberty ships constructed from prefabricated sections, assembled in record time. Each of these leaders worked with a clear mandate: output over ornament. Roosevelt's political genius was recognizing that America's strength resided not in command, but in cooperation, a democratic mobilization of engineers, laborers, and capitalists. Germany's counterpart, Albert Speer, took over as armaments minister in 1942 and brought genuine organizational skill. He centralized control, eliminated redundancies, and improved coordination among arms manufacturers. Yet Speer fought an unwinnable battle. His factories operated under bombing raids, resource shortages, and Hitler's erratic interference. While Roosevelt's team worked in an atmosphere of innovation and freedom, Speer's system suffocated under ideology and fear. Efficiency cannot thrive in tyranny. It requires trust. Roosevelt's America gave its people ownership of victory. Speer's Germany demanded obedience to survive. For most of the war, German industrial workers believed they were part of the world's most advanced machine. Propaganda films glorified the precision of their factories, the brilliance of their engineers, and the superiority of German design. But as Allied bombing intensified and supplies dwindled, the illusion began to crumble. By 1944, many German workers had seen or heard of captured American equipment. Radios, jeeps, aircraft engines stamped with serial numbers that hinted at endless production. Even German engineers marveled at the simplicity of American designs. When the Allies advanced through France and the Low Countries, they uncovered abandoned depots filled with destroyed panzers, waiting for replacement parts that never came. Prisoners of war spoke of supply depots on the Allied side overflowing with spares, fuel, and food. Inside Germany, the contrast grew impossible to ignore. Workers toiled in underground factories, deprived of daylight and bombarded by propaganda, urging them to outproduce the enemy. But deep down, they sensed the truth. They were no longer competing, they were surviving. Reports from industrial managers filtered upward. Productivity declined. Morale faltered. The once proud industrial base of the Reich had turned into a network of desperate workshops. In the final months of the war, when American troops captured intact factories, German engineers sometimes volunteered to show them around, not out of defiance but curiosity. They wanted to see what an assembly line looked like without interruption, without fear. It was no longer hatred that defined their view of the enemy. It was awe, the Industrial War revealed. Something deeper than machinery or management, it exposed a moral dimension in the way societies organized themselves. Germany's war industry reflected the authoritarian ideals of its regime. Centralized power, rigid hierarchy, and the glorification of elite craftsmanship. The system trusted only a few, the experts, the engineers, the chosen. It was a pyramid built on control. The American model was its mirror image. It depended on millions of average people working together, each task small but essential. Every welder, typist, driver, and foreman shared responsibility. Production was democratized. That difference, one between faith in the few and trust in the many, became the moral foundation of industrial victory. The assembly line itself was a metaphor for democracy in motion. Individuals united in sequence, creating something greater than anyone could build alone. When the war ended, and German workers saw the vastness of American production firsthand, the realization was not just technical, it was existential. They understood that defeat had come from more than steel and oil. It had come from the way their nation viewed its own people. In the American factory, the worker was empowered. In the German factory, he was commanded. And in that moral equation as much as in the mechanical one, the outcome was already decided. The moral, technical, and human threads had all converged. The war's turning point would not occur in a single battle, but in 1,000 workshops where machines replaced myths and scale became destiny. What happened next, when America's assembly lines reached their unstoppable crescendo, would seal the fate of the Reich forever. By 1943, the Industrial War had reached its decisive phase. Battles were still fought across continents, but the outcome was now being written in smoke and steel thousands of miles behind the front lines. In the United States, the rhythm of production was unlike anything in history. The figures no longer read as numbers. They were symphonies of scale. Each month, American factories produced more aircraft engines than Germany could build in a year. Shipyards operated day and night, cranes moving like clockwork under the floodlights. The nation's industrial output doubled again between 1942 and 1944, an achievement no enemy could comprehend. At Willow Run, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, the vast hangar floor stretched over 80 acres. From above, it resembled a metallic river, with workers standing shoulder to shoulder as aircraft frames moved continuously along a mile-long line. Each bomber was assembled from standardized parts arriving from all corners of the country. Engines from Pratt & Whitney, landing gear from Goodyear, radios from RCA. The system was not merely efficient. It was unstoppable. A B-24 Liberator, one of the most complex aircraft ever built, once required months to complete. By 1944, one rolled out every 63 minutes. The scale was beyond imagination. While America surged forward, Germany's system began to collapse under its own weight. That same year, the Allied air campaign struck deep into the Reich. The Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany, became a wasteland of twisted metal and cratered earth. Ball-bearing plants, steel mills, and refineries lay in ruins. Transportation lines shattered. The once proud factories of Essen and Dortmund now worked under candlelight, their roofs gone, their walls scorched. Albert Speer ordered production dispersed into underground tunnels and forests, a desperate measure that only slowed efficiency further. Workers labored in darkness, surrounded by damp walls and the constant threat of collapse. Machines built for open assembly floors were crammed into mines and caves, their precision ruined by dirt and vibration. By 1944, the contrast between the two worlds could not have been more striking. In the United States, war production had become a form of spectacle. Newsreels showed women in headscarves welding bombers, men guiding glowing steel from furnaces, assembly lines running like living organisms. In Germany, production was silent, hidden, and fearful. Even Speer, the architect of Nazi industry, would later admit the truth in his memoirs. The war was lost not on the battlefield, but in the factories of America. The evidence was everywhere. The Allied invasion of Italy, the strategic bombing of Hamburg, the defeat at Kursk, all were outcomes of an enemy that could replace what it lost faster than Germany could build anew. American industry turned logistics into an art form. Massive depots in England stocked parts for tanks, trucks, and planes by the tens of thousands. When the Allies invaded Normandy in June 1944, they brought with them not just soldiers, but the infrastructure of a small nation, pipelines for fuel, floating harbors, mobile workshops. German officers at the front began to see the truth through binoculars. Convoys of endless American trucks, the legendary Red Ball Express, snaked their way through Europe, delivering supplies faster than the Wehrmacht could destroy them. Each tire, each spark plug, each gallon of gasoline was a reminder of the industrial storm now bearing down on the Reich. Inside Germany, production targets became meaningless. Oil shortages crippled the Luftwaffe. The once feared Messerschmitt squadrons could barely take off. Factories, though rebuilt underground, lacked the fuel to run their generators. The American machine, by contrast, seemed tireless. Every hour, ships departed from New York, Baltimore, and San Francisco, laden with cargo that could arm entire divisions. It was not just abundance, it was consistency, the rhythm of a system that had learned to think in cycles, not crises. In Berlin, reports from intelligence officers painted a picture so grim that even Hitler refused to believe them. They spoke of American shipyards where entire vessels were assembled in weeks, of plants in Chicago that turned out more machine guns than Germany could dream of warehouses filled with spare engines waiting for aircraft yet to be built. The Führer raged against the numbers, calling them lies, exaggerations, propaganda. But deep in their hearts, those who worked the German lathes and presses knew. The war had already tipped, not at Stalingrad or Normandy, but here in the factories. For all its pride, precision, and willpower, the Reich had entered a war of machines with a nation that had mastered the art of building them. And that mastery was now flooding across the Atlantic, carried on steel hulls bound for every battlefield on Earth. In the final years of the war, the difference between the two industrial worlds became a revelation, one that cut deeper than any bomb. When Allied troops advanced into Western Germany in 1945, they captured not just soldiers but entire factories, intact and silent. In some, half-finished aircraft sat on assembly racks, engines waiting for parts that would never arrive. In others, workers stood idle, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow from exhaustion and disbelief. For many of these men and women, the end of the war was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow unveiling. They had spent years believing in their technological superiority. The Tiger tank, the Messerschmitt jet, the V-2 rocket, all symbols of brilliance and defiance. But as the Allies pushed deeper into the heart of the Reich, the myth dissolved into a simple, painful truth. Perfection had been defeated by production. American troops often brought film reels and magazines showing scenes from home, endless assembly lines, massive shipyards, aircraft fields stretching beyond the horizon. For German workers, these images were incomprehensible. They had built machines with their hands. Americans built them with systems. In April 1945, when the Allies occupied parts of Bavaria, a group of German engineers from Messerschmitt's Augsburg plant was escorted to an American base for questioning. There, they were shown footage of Ford's Willow Run assembly line, bombers moving in a continuous flow, each part arriving on schedule, each process mapped in seconds. The Germans watched in silence. No one spoke. One engineer simply shook his head and muttered, "Das ist unmöglich." That is impossible. But it was not impossible. It was the inevitable result of a nation that had transformed its factories into extensions of its will. Elsewhere, captured officers were taken to see American production firsthand. In the ruins of Europe, they visited Allied repair depots and supply yards, mountains of equipment neatly stacked, crates marked for destinations around the globe. The sheer abundance left them speechless. One German major later wrote, "We thought we were fighting men. We were fighting a continent." The turning point of realization was not on the front line, but in these moments of confrontation with industrial reality. Every German who stepped into an American plant understood instantly what statistics had long implied. The war had never been equal. While Germany fought to produce hundreds, America produced tens of thousands. For every Tiger tank, there were dozens of Shermans. For every U-boat, hundreds of Liberty ships waited in convoy. And for every aircraft lost, a replacement was already in flight. In Detroit and Chicago, the sound of victory was mechanical, a hum that never stopped. Machines stamped, riveted, welded, painted, and assembled in an endless loop. Even as soldiers bled in Europe, the war's real heart pulsed safely at home. For the Germans who witnessed it, the shock was more than technical. It was emotional. They had believed in the supremacy of human skill, of the craftsman's touch, of the engineer's genius. But here was something different, the triumph of a collective, a democracy of labor where every hand mattered equally. When Speer himself toured captured Allied equipment after the war, he admitted the inevitable. "I knew then that we had been defeated long before the first bomb fell," he said. The Americans had turned industry into a weapon beyond comprehension. The River Rouge plant became a symbol of that truth. In 1945, groups of German specialists, escorted by Allied officials, walked its length. They saw raw iron enter one end of the complex and finished vehicles leave the other. A complete industrial ecosystem contained within a single horizon. Some stared in silence. Others took notes they would never use. What they saw was not a factory, but a world that had rendered their own obsolete. They realized that while Germany had pursued control, America had pursued motion. And in motion lay momentum, and in momentum, victory. Outside, as the sun set behind the smokestacks, one of the German foremen asked an American guide how many people worked there. "About 80,000, came the reply. He nodded slowly, the weight of it sinking in. 80,000 workers in one plant, more than an entire German division. It was then that the truth of defeat ceased to be abstract. It was not about lost battles or captured cities. It was about numbers, about systems, about a rhythm so vast that it could not be stopped. Not by courage, not by genius, not by belief. For those who saw it with their own eyes, that moment of understanding was the real capitulation. The weapons had gone silent, but in the echo of the machines, they heard the verdict of history. Germany's surrender in May 1945 was not merely a political act, it was the formal acknowledgement of an industrial collapse that had already taken place months before. The factories of the Reich lay in ruins, railways twisted by bombing, fuel depots drained dry. The once mighty industrial heartland of Europe, Essen, Hamburg, Stuttgart, had become silent fields of rubble and ash. But amid that destruction, the victors turned their attention to something beyond vengeance: understanding. The Allies wanted to know how the world's most advanced engineering culture had lost a war of machines. In the months after surrender, delegations of American, British, and Soviet officers began visiting German industrial sites. Engineers, technicians, and foremen were questioned not only about weapons, but about production, how assembly was organized, how labor was managed, where resources came from. It was less an interrogation than an autopsy. The findings were consistent. Germany's system, though brilliant, had been brittle. It relied on precision and control, not resilience. Factories depended on individual skill rather than modular design. When bombing or shortages disrupted a single plant, entire supply chains collapsed. By contrast, the Allies' networks, especially America's, were fluid and redundant. If one factory was destroyed, another could instantly compensate. Every machine had interchangeable parts. Every process could shift location. The difference between the two systems was not technological, but philosophical, and as German engineers began to see the Allied system firsthand, the revelation deepened. Under Allied supervision, small groups of German specialists were invited to tour American facilities. They visited Ford's River Rouge complex, General Motors tank plants, and the aircraft factories that had once been secret war assets. What they saw there confirmed everything they had begun to suspect. At River Rouge, they watched iron ore arrive on conveyor belts, pass through blast furnaces, and emerge as gleaming steel ready for assembly, all within one continuous flow. At Willow Run, they walked beneath hangars that dwarfed entire city blocks, where thousands of workers moved in perfect synchronization without ever seeing the final product. There was no artistry, no flourish, just precision born of process. Many of them took notes in silence. Some shook their heads. One visitor later recalled feeling as though we had stepped into the future. For these men, defeat no longer meant humiliation. It became revelation, a recognition that Germany's devotion to perfection had blinded it to progress. The Americans treated them not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. Their factories spoke for them. No lectures were needed. The lesson was unmistakable. Power in the modern age belonged not to the most gifted engineer, but to the most efficient system. Back home, in the ruins of their cities, German workers began to absorb that truth. The occupation authorities encouraged industrial reorganization. Surviving companies like Siemens, Volkswagen, and Krupp were dismantled, studied, and eventually rebuilt under new principles, emphasizing standardization, automation, and mass accessibility. The American model was no longer an enemy's secret. It became a template. In a strange irony, the same assembly lines that had broken Germany would soon inspire its rebirth. But in 1945, that future was still distant. The present was one of silence, the hum of machines replaced by the quiet of surrender. In that silence, German engineers walked through the remnants of their own factories, stepping over shattered lathes and burned-out presses. They had once believed that human mastery could overcome any obstacle. Now they understood that in the age of mass production, mastery alone was not enough. Defeat had taught them what no victory ever could. In the years that followed Germany's defeat, the lesson learned in those American factories began to reshape the entire landscape of post-war Europe. What had been humiliation in 1945 became transformation by 1950. The Allied occupation authorities, through programs like the Marshall Plan, sought not only to rebuild Germany's cities, but to re-engineer its economic foundations. American advisors encouraged decentralization of industry, open competition, and, above all, efficiency through standardization. German engineers, once bound by rigid hierarchies, were now urged to adopt flexible systems, to think in terms of flow rather than control. Factories that survived the bombings were rebuilt from the ground up. Those that didn't were reborn with a new philosophy, combining German precision with American scale. The concept of Massenfertigung, mass production, entered technical vocabulary as both aspiration and necessity. In Wolfsburg, the Volkswagen plant became a symbol of this synthesis. Once conceived under Nazi direction, it was revived under British and American oversight. The Volkswagen Beetle, a car designed for the masses, became Germany's first true export success after the war. Its assembly line, modeled after American systems, was simple, efficient, and reliable. By the 1950s, thousands rolled off the line every week. Elsewhere, companies like Siemens and BASF began to implement American-style production planning, balancing efficiency with innovation. The result was a new kind of German industry, pragmatic rather than ideological, systematic rather than autocratic. The scars of war remained, but from them rose the foundations of the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Behind this transformation lay an unspoken understanding, shared by thousands of former wartime workers, that their defeat had been mechanical before it was military. They had seen the truth in the endless rows of American bombers, in the assembly lines that moved with the precision of an army. They had touched the future, and it had changed them. Even Albert Speer, imprisoned for war crimes, continued to reflect on this shift. In his writings from Spandau prison, he acknowledged the futility of Germany's wartime production system. We were engineers fighting against an age of organization. Our brilliance could not compete with their system. The new generation of German engineers took those words to heart. In universities and trade schools, production science replaced the old artisan mentality. Students studied case examples from American plants, learned about workflow diagrams, and experimented with automation. Across the Atlantic, American industrialists also took note. They saw in Germany's recovery the validation of their own system, proof that the assembly line was not just an economic tool, but a model for rebuilding nations. By the late 1950s, the two former enemies were now partners, their industries intertwined. Ford opened plants in Cologne. General Electric collaborated with Siemens. Airplane manufacturers exchanged designs and components. The war that had once divided them now bound them in a shared language of production. And yet, among older German workers, memories of that first encounter with America's industrial might never faded. Some would speak quietly of the day they stepped inside those vast hangars, the moment they understood that their world had ended, not with a battle but with a revelation. They had seen machines move without pause, workers move without fear, and factories breathe like living organisms. It was there, beneath the bright lights and endless motion, that they realized what total war truly meant, not just the mobilization of armies, but the mobilization of a civilization. Germany's defeat had been total, because America's mobilization had been total. In the decades that followed, both nations would rise to prosperity, but neither would forget the lesson that had been learned amid the roar of those assembly lines, that in modern war, the forge, the press, and the lathe are as decisive as any gun or general, and that victory belongs ultimately to the nation that can build faster than it can destroy. History often remembers wars through battles, generals, and flags, but sometimes the true turning points unfold in silence, inside factories, beneath steel roofs, among men and women whose weapons are machines. The Second World War was one such conflict. Beneath its blood and chaos ran another current, the rhythm of production. It was there, in the harmony of industry, that the United States found its decisive strength and Germany met its quiet defeat. For the German workers who walked those American assembly lines in 1945, realization came not as humiliation but as clarity. They had believed in mastery, in the craftsman's hand, in the engineer's brilliance, in the individual mind. But what they saw before them was something different, an entire society moving as one mechanism, every citizen a cog in a greater design. That was the secret, not genius, but organization, not pride, but process. From that understanding grew the post-war world. Germany rebuilt, not by imitating America, but by harmonizing its precision with America's scale, creating industries that valued both excellence and efficiency. In time, the lesson of defeat became the foundation of renewal. The assembly line that once symbolized their loss became a shared ideal, proof that power lies not in domination, but in cooperation. Looking back, one truth remains immutable. No army, no ideology, no invention can outlast the momentum of a united society. The hum of 1,000 machines, the rhythm of countless workers acting in concert, these are the true sounds of victory. And so, the story ends not with gunfire but with motion, the endless turning of gears, the steady pulse of progress. Because in that war, the moment Germany's workers saw America's assembly lines, they didn't just witness defeat, they saw the future.